that happened, Luther some of Luther's friends said Calvin's kind of getting worked up about this, and Luther backed off the subject and didn't want to split the Reformation over what he considered a minor point. So Luther kind of got quiet. John Calvin never did get quiet, and he kept teaching what he was teaching. And because of that, you end up with the Catholics against the Anabaptists, Calvin's against the Anabaptists, and Luther being quiet. And guess who won? Well, of course, it was Calvin and the Catholics carried the day, and the Anabaptists got hushed up, and that was the way that went. So Calvin was very important in perpetuating the doctrine of eternal torment. Although Calvin himself, in his writings, and in my appendix at the back of The Fire That Consumes, I go into many details about this with direct quotes and sources that they come from. Calvin himself taught that human beings only have life because God gives us life. And he said if God withdrew His grace of life for even one moment, we would totally cease to exist. And he believes that in the end of the world, the only reason we have life forever is because God gives it to us. So he was really a conditional, immortal person when he got right down to it. But when he talked about hell, he forgot that he said all that. And he begins to reason from the immortality of the soul and do just like Augustine had done before him. And so Calvin ends up really pressing that point very hard. Meanwhile, in England, and I left out a little detail here, in England already when Luther was teaching his stuff, Tyndale, well, actually Sir Thomas More first, a Catholic. Sir Thomas More in England was a Catholic, began to oppose Luther's teaching publicly. And when he did that, Tyndale, who was what will later be called a Protestant, Tyndale came to Luther's defense, and he said the Bible teaches that man has immortality as a gift of God, but the Pope, substituting popish doctrines for the Word of God, teacheth that man is immortal. And so Tyndale took up with Luther, and then Calvin came out against all of that. There was another man who was on Calvin's side named Heinrich Bullinger. And in England, when Bloody Mary was queen and persecuting Protestants, many Protestants fled to the continent for safety, and they went to Geneva and other places on the continent where they bumped into the teaching of John Calvin and of Heinrich Bullinger. Bullinger wrote what was one of the earliest Protestant creeds called the Second Helvetic or Swiss Confession. I believe it was 1586, somewhere within a few years of there. And he wrote into this confession of faith the doctrine of the immortality of the soul and eternal torment. So when these Protestants who escaped from England to Europe were being taught over there, they were taught these things. When they came back to England after Mary was gone and the Protestants were in charge again, they brought these doctrines back with them. And when they later wrote the Westminster Confession, they incorporated into their confession of faith the same teachings that Heinrich Bullinger had put in his confession of faith. This becomes part of the teaching of the Scottish Presbyterians and later the Puritans in England, and when they come to America, they bring this doctrine with them. From the time of the Reformation forward, there were always some group of extreme heretics or cultic type people who taught the destruction of the wicked along with their bad doctrines. In the Reformation, the Anabaptists were considered that way by the other Protestants. So in the Reformation, you didn't want to sound like you were sympathetic to these views because somebody might associate you with the Anabaptists. In the next century, you have a group of people called Socinians, and they taught that Jesus was a created being and was not the eternal Son of God. They also taught that man is mortal, but you didn't want to say man is mortal because somebody might say, well, you sound like a Socinian, and you didn't want to be tarred with that brush. In the next century, you've got people called the Arians, and they again taught that Jesus was a created being, kind of like what the Jehovah's Witnesses teach today, but they also taught the mortality of the man and the destruction of the wicked. So you didn't want to say these things about hell because somebody would say, well, you sound like an Arian, and you didn't want to be associated with them. Then they come down to the 20th century, and you've got late 19th century and then the 20th century, the founders, ancestors of what came to be Jehovah's Witnesses, and then later the Seventh-day Adventists, who at the early years were considered a cult by most mainline Protestants. Not so now, but it used to be that way. And so even until the time most of us were grown, Christian people in general did not want to say anything questioning the traditional doctrine of hell out loud, because there's somebody going to jump on you and say, well, you sound like a Jehovah's Witness, or you sound like an Adventist, or whatever. Then there's one other very important thing. In the early years of the 20th century, 1910, 1912, thereabouts, there were written a group of, I think, 6 books called the Fundamentals, which were the fundamentals of the Christian faith. These were basically written by scholars who taught at Princeton Seminary, which in those days was conservative, and they were distributed to preachers all over the United States free of charge. One of the teachings of, 2 of the teachings of this series of books, the Fundamentals, were the immortality of the soul and the eternal torment of the wicked. In opposition to the fundamentalists were people who denied those things, but they also denied that there was a hell at all, and they also denied that Jesus was really the Son of God. They denied miracles, and they denied creation, and they denied the inspiration of the Bible, and they didn't believe in a literal resurrection, and they didn't believe in heaven and hell. And these people were referred to as modernists. So there came to be test sheets that people would give to preachers or other Bible teachers if you're going to hire somebody or be associated with them. They'd give them their doctrinal test sheet to see if they were sound or not. And included in those doctrines would always be, do you believe in a literal hell? Do you believe the wicked will suffer eternal torment forever? And if you said no, they say, aha, you must be a modernist. So nobody wanted to be a modernist, so you didn't talk about it in those days either. This doesn't sound real nice, but I think in context it makes sense. Somebody defined the difference between a modernist and a fundamentalist. A modernist said there ain't no hell, and the fundamentalist said the hell there ain't. But that's kind of, it was pretty tough head-on conflict, and it was very dangerous to express your views out loud if you didn't agree with the eternal doctrine of eternal torment. It was kind of interesting, about 1840, 1850, there was a man in the movement I come from in the Church of Christ named Moses Lard, who wrote a book called Eternal, I believe is the name of it, in which he says that the Bible's words translated eternal do not necessarily mean unending, but rather mean longer than the eye can see the end to, and is age-lasting or something like that. And in his book, he makes the statement something along these lines. He says in the preface, the times are not right now for men to consider with open mind the things I'm saying in this book. But he either said I predict or I prophesy. And he didn't claim to be a prophet, but he used one of those words that 100 years from now, tempers will be different, and this subject will be studied open-mindedly. Well, a friend who was a great traditionalist preacher sent me a copy of Laird's book when I was doing my research, and I was fascinated to see that Laird, who said this about 100 years from now, either wrote that book 100 years before the year I was born, or he wrote it 100 years from the time I was writing this Fire That Consumes. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good guess that times will change in 100 years. And as it's happened with InterVarsity Press, particularly printing the 2 views of hell, on the back of which they say evangelical Christians hold 2 views, and they make it sound like they're equally valuable and valid, and you might be one or you might be the other, and it's okay either way. That just flew in the face of all the traditionalist people who thought this was horrible, and they couldn't stand the idea that InterVarsity is giving some credence to this view that they considered heretical. But that's the way it happened. And these days, the Advent people who have always taught conditional immortality are kind of upset. I mean, they're not upset. They're happy that so many people are coming to accept this teaching of conditional immortality. But at the same time they're happy, they're also a little bit unhappy, because it's like this was our doctrine for the last 125 years, and we were persecuted standing alone for this teaching, and now other people are saying it, and kind of they stole our thunder, and why do we even exist any longer if everybody's coming to think this way? It's kind of like charismatic and Pentecostal people would be when the other Christians and other denominations and groups accept the gifts of the Spirit and things like that. And if I tell you that a lot of Church of Christ people are open to that these days, you could start saying, well, I'm glad to hear it. Then you could start saying, well, I don't know if I'm glad or not. I'd rather keep that for Pentecostals. Well, the truth is, all truth is for all God's people. And everybody needs to share the good stuff everybody else has. So that's kind of what happened. Next slide. We're running out of steam and running out of time.